Today in our society and in previous generations, we have always relied on oil and coal power. Although these energy sources are convenient and relatively cheap to extract, they are detrimental to our environmental safety. We would need almost 400 coal plants to produce roughly 30% of our nation's electricity, and oil requires over 1,000 plants to generate just half of 1% of our nation's electricity. As we can see, oil requires such a large amount of plants to produce such a little amount of electricity. Coal, although it produces a large amount of energy, releases harmful CO2 emissions, and the mining itself destroys habitats beyond repair. Since our country is such a large area, many different states experience many different types of weather patterns. For example, Florida is much more sunny and warm, while Washington experiences more harsh and cold weather patterns. To combat this issue, we must look at each other's weather type. We must look at each region's weather type to determine what kind of renewable energy source is best suited for them.
When looking at hydropower, we can see that the West Coast, East Coast, and Gulf of Mexico have many ports and inland waterways. Therefore, hydropower would be best suited for these areas. Hydropower produces 7% of the nation's electricity. In order to help increase this percentage, we will include other forms of renewable energy as well. The first type of renewable energy form we will use is nuclear. There are 61 nuclear electric plants in the United States which generate roughly 20% of the nation's electricity. Nuclear energy is more prevalent in the East Coast. Some advantages include that there are no CO2 emissions, it has a higher energy output, while some disadvantages include that we are unsure currently of how waste should be disposed and how to prevent certain malfunctions from occurring.
Although solar has an expensive installation cost, the return on investment is quite worth it. We understand that solar does not produce the largest amount of electricity, producing only 1% of our nation's electricity. This is why we decided that solar power would only truly be focused on larger buildings, cars, and schools. Using solar power like this would allow us to produce a high amount of energy in smaller areas rather than trying to produce it for larger areas, more concentrated in the southern, Midwestern, and West Coast as well. Some advantages would include cheap maintenance, and it is versatile. Some disadvantages would be expensive installation costs and the constant need for it to be sunny in order to receive and store power. Compared to other renewable energy sources, wind has been on the rise as a reliable energy source. Wind generates 6% of our nation's electricity. They are most useful in the Great Plains, where wind blows across open fields. Some advantages are wind uses no fossil fuels and less CO2 emissions to no CO2 emissions. It's sustainable, produces a sufficient amount of energy with the amount of plants needed. 99 plants produce around 6% of energy. It's cost effective too. Disadvantages include higher initial investment. It can only be used effectively in certain regions where there is more windy climates, aesthetic pollution, and it causes a lot of deaths for birds.
It would be great if our country could go 100% renewable at this very moment, but in reality, this ideology is too unrealistic. We need to realize that things may go wrong, and in case that happens, we need some sort of backup plan to ensure that no one will be without electricity. This is where natural gas comes into play. With roughly 1,700 plants, it produces roughly 34% of our nation's electricity, and these gas reserves are located all over the country. With enough regulation, we can put limits on how many wells are located in each state and ensure that all these wells will not affect water supplies that support households, schools, and other types of buildings. Some advantages are much lower carbon emissions than coal, much more reliable in any type of weather pattern, and some disadvantages are that they can pollute water sources and are flammable. Some future predictions that we are talking about is we would like to see our nation become almost 60% renewable in the next 15 years and roughly 95% renewable in the next 45 years. The U.S. is highly dependent on foreign nations for oil. This has caused foreign oil crisis in our country and an economic depression that has caused unproductivity in the U.S. Some examples include the oil crisis in 1973 and 2003, where oil embargoes have caused oil prices to increase exponentially. Less dependence on oil means less dependence on foreign nations and their call on our economy.
After looking at all this data, we can determine that it is possible for our country to move to a majority use of renewable energy. The only major issue with these ideas is the money. How is it going to be paid for? We can possibly get the government to subsidize the majority of these costs, but regardless, tax dollars will have to increase or relocating money in government spending. Decreasing government spending from our defense and instead put more money to subsidize these more expensive ways of producing more renewable energy. With the way taxes will work is that it will be a percentage of everyone's income so that it is equal for everyone. 15% for the general public, but for the top 1%, if more than 10 million is made, anything over that will be charged 40%. For example, if 20 million is made, then they keep the first 10 million and are taxed 40% on second, meaning they keep an additional 6 million.
The approach we take will be slow and gradual because we trust that we will be able to solve errors as they come up. We hope to be able to create a more sustainable and long-lasting future for the next generations.